I was supposed to these colors with me. Well, I was bleaching the bathroom and wearing my new sweatshirt. I screwed it. Oh, not very smart.
Okay, are there any questions before we start today? So we're going to continue on with our discussion of the brain. And remember that we were talking about the cerebral cortex. And so what type of matter is the cerebral cortex? Gray matter. And so what does it contain that makes it gray versus white? What would you find in the gray matter if you were to look at it from a histological perspective, if you were to look at the tissue underneath a microscope? Cell bodies and dendrites. Excellent. So remember, the white matter has to do with the myelin, the presence of myelination, which in the central nervous system is due to oligodendrocytes that wrap around the axons. So the nerve cell bodies in the brain are on the outside, but if you'll remember from our lab that the nerve cell bodies in the spinal cord are exactly the opposite. So they're actually the butterfly-shaped structure inside, and then the white matter is on the outside. So it's kind of interesting the difference between histologically between the brain and the spinal cord. So why do we have these convolutions? What did we describe? What was the basis for those convolutions? What does that allow for? Yes, and so if it didn't have convolutions, there would be less surface area. So the convolutions actually increase the surface area over which we can have these cell bodies. So we talked about how mammals tend to have convolutions in their brain, whereas non-mammals do not. So also remember that we talked about the 5 different lobes of the brain that correspond to the structures in the skull. So the frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, and then the one that is inside is called the insula. So it is actually inside this lateral sulcus, which is right here, this lateral sulcus. So we're going to talk about this central sulcus. And so notice that the central sulcus is a region of the brain that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So that's the central sulcus. And so we're going to talk about that right now as we talk about the different parts of the cerebral cortex. Maybe. Okay. So the cerebral cortex is that which is responsible for conscious perception. Oops, I went too far. So there are actually 3 different categories of areas. So when we look at the areas in the cerebral cortex, we have motor, we have sensory, so conscious perception of sensory, and then the conscious perception of movement, like being able to contract a muscle consciously. And then we have what is called association. So these association areas allow us to recognize an image. So for example, we have a visual cortex that allows us to see an image, but we have to have an association area in order for us to make sense of that image. The same thing with hearing. We could hear a sound, we could hear a language, but we need an association area in order to make sense of that language. And so these are the three broad areas of the cerebral cortex. And so we're going to look at the motor cortex or the motor areas in a little bit more detail. And so we have what is called the motor cortex. And this motor cortex is in front of that central sulcus. And so it is called the pre-central sulcus gyri or gyrus, right? So it is the ridge that is in front of that groove. So if we were to go back and we look at where the central sulcus is, this is my central sulcus. And so this is my pre-sulcus central gyrus or precentral sulcus gyrus, right? So it's in front of the sulcus, but it is a ridge. And so this motor cortex is really interesting because this is what allows us to be able to consciously move different parts of our body. So this is responsible for conscious movement of skeletal muscle. And the really interesting thing about the motor cortex is that it is mapped so that different parts of the cortex are associated with different parts of the body. And so if we were to look at a map of this, it is referred to as a homunculus or homunculus. So a little human or a little man, right? So this is the mapping of movement to the cortex. So if we look at an image that shows this, you might have seen something similar right here. So this on the red side is the motor area. The one that is the gyrus that is behind the central sulcus is this somatosensory. So that's touch and also perception of movement, like in the joints. And so you'll notice here that the body parts are mapped. And so what we can do, we can put somebody in a PET scan and we can have them move their face, right? Move their muscles in their face. And then we can see what part of the cortex lights up. And so this is the way that we are able to map different areas of the body. And so somebody actually created kind of a cute 3-dimensional model of this. So if we look at this 3-dimensional model, see if I can find my rest of my stuff. Oops, that's not it. Sorry. Color is Tuesday. I wanted that one, but I didn't. Okay. All right. So this is the way that our cortex is designed. And so you'll notice that the size of the hands refers to the size of the part of the cortex that is responsible for consciously moving our hands. So you'll notice that fine motor control takes more parts of the cortex. And so the ability to speak is probably that tongue, right? And then the face, the facial expressions. And then if you look at like fine motor control in the shoulder, it is pretty much non-existent, right? We can't just move our shoulder in fine ways. It's generally gross motor movement. And so not as much of the cerebral cortex is taken up by that. So one of the things that we thought when we were first, or scientists thought when they were first studying the brain, is that this was actually established during your childhood, and then the brain stopped changing. And so there was this idea that there was very little plasticity in the brain, that it was kind of set in stone. And that was actually kind of a central dogma for a long period of time, and it's just now being overturned. So we can actually change the structure of the brain even when we're adults and even when we're older. So let's say, for example, you have amputation of an arm. So when that happens, we'll talk about phantom limb in a little bit when we talk about sensory, but when you amputate the arm, that part of the cortex, and you start maybe using your feet, so you know people that maybe have to use their feet instead of their hands, then that part of the cortex that is responsible for the feet can actually enlarge. Right? And so there is a lot more plasticity in the brain than we once believed. And so the brain can change itself with behavior. Okay, so these are actually connected. The motor cortex is actually connected to the white matter. So it's connected to the white matter via what is called the corticospinal tracts. So notice that this is not nerves. So in the central nervous system, remember, a bundle of myelinated axons are called tracts. And then if you look at this word, cortico means that you have the cortex, and then the spinal would mean that you're connecting those motor neurons that are in the motor cortex, you're connecting them to the spinal cord. And so obviously action potentials have to travel here from the cortex all the way down to the spinal cord and then out to the nerves in my hand, where they innervate the skeletal muscles, which would allow movement. Okay. Sometimes these are also called pyramidal cells. Pyramidal. So these large pyramidal cells make up the corticospinal tracts. So that's part of what the white matter is in our cerebral hemispheres, is just the connection of the cortex to the lower brain centers and to the spinal cord. Okay. So we also have in the motor cortex, we have what is called Broca's area. And has anybody studied this in psychology and might know what Broca's area is responsible for? It's motor. Anybody remember?
It's like
Speaking, excellent. So this is motor coordination of speech. Oops, coordination. Right, so if you have problems speaking and forming words, it might be due to problems in your Broca's area. So again, if you have brain damage or if you get trauma to that given part of the brain, that could affect speech area, okay? We also have what is called the premotor cortex. So this is actually in front of the cortex. And this is responsible for learned movements. So complex learned movements. This actually works in coordination. We'll talk about the cerebellum, which is not part of the cerebrum, but we'll talk about the cerebellum because it also does something similar. So for example, learning how to play a piano, you would first start out trying to consciously press the keys, and then pretty soon you get better at it, and then pretty soon it just becomes automatic. And so the premotor cortex is responsible for kind of that automatic movement during learned movements. And then we have what is called the frontal, which is also in the front part of the brain, the frontal lobe, the frontal eye field. And this is responsible for eye movement. Right? So the ability to track an object, right? The ability to move your eyes, that's in response to stimuli, that would be, and so this is skeletal muscle still. This isn't like pupil dilation, which is something else, it's a different part of the brain. Okay, so those are the motor areas. So if we look at them on our diagram, okay, so these are the motor areas. We have the primary motor cortex, we have the premotor cortex, we have the frontal eye field, and then we have this Broca's area, which is these dashed lines.
Are brains kind of like fingerprints, or do most of them generally look the same?
They generally look the same, yeah. Although there's obviously differences in terms of sometimes people are born with different types of brains. Sometimes the brains, you know, some people actually, there's actually been known to people that were born with only half of a brain, and that half of the brain somehow does the trick for almost everything, and they are able to survive fairly well, which is half a brain. Okay. So let's look at the sensory parts of the brain. So ignore that. Ignore that. So let's look at the sensory parts of the brain. So this is the sensory cortex. Okay. So we have a part of the brain that is called the somatosensory cortex. And it is the post-central gyrus. So it is behind the central sulcus. It's in the back. And the somatosensory, somato means body. So this means things that information from the surface of the skin. So touch would be an example, big example, right? But also pain from the skin. So we can determine when we have been injured, for example. Visceral pain is a little bit different. Visceral pain is not part of this. Visceral being inside the organ, like if you have gallbladder problems, for example. And then this is also proprioception. So proprioception has to do with joints and muscles. So I can tell when my elbow is bent, and I can kind of tell when a muscle is contracted. And that is because when those things happen, receptors in those places go to the somatosensory cortex and give me the conscious perception of that, right? So sensory information sends action potentials in, and then they're perceived, and that part of the brain lights up. So if I was to touch my foot versus my wrist, different parts of my somatosensory cortex would light up. And so this is, again, where we have that homunculus. Oops, I went too far, sorry. This is where we have the homunculus, and it looks very similar to that which is shown in the motor part of the brain. So this is kind of deceiving in that they're showing it on two different sides of the hemispheres, but if you look at that picture up above, both sides of the hemispheres, right? So it's really important to realize that if I'm touching my right arm, it actually goes to my left hemisphere. If I'm touching my, if I'm touching my right arm, it goes to my left. If I'm touching my left arm, it goes to my right. So sensory information, it crosses over in general. Okay. The other parts of our sensory cortex include primary visual cortex, primary auditory cortex. And the reason why these have a primary in front of them is that in order to see, we have to have action potentials coming via our optic nerve to the cortex, but then we also have to have action potentials sent to the association areas so that we can make sense of it, okay? And then we have the vestibular cortex. So can anybody give me what they think that might sense? Vestibular, what is your vestibular apparatus in your inner ear perceive? Not sound, balance, right? So this is balance, or this is your orientation to gravity, right? So you can tell when you are upside down versus right side up. You can generally tell when you're accelerating and when you're decelerating, but sometimes when we're sitting in a car and it's constant acceleration, it's very hard for us to sense that. Olfactory, which would be what? Smell. Gustatory. What do you think? Taste. And then we have the visceral sensory. So this is organ, right? So the viscera, the organs in the body. Like the stomach, for example, or the heart, or the lungs. Okay, so if we look at these different areas in the brain, the visual cortex is actually near the back. And so you can see here that right near the back is the visual cortex. So if somebody gets hit in the back of the head, that can sometimes affect your vision, right? And then notice that right next to it is an association area. So that visual association area gives information about what it is you're seeing and what makes sense. Okay? Auditory, obviously kind of near the ear, right? And then you also have an auditory association area. And that is actually part of Wernicke's, so you can write down Wernicke's there next to the auditory, because this is our ability to make sense of language. So Broca's area is the ability to speak. And the Wernicke's area is the ability to understand the stimuli. Okay. So there is a really interesting thing that sometimes happens in a small proportion of the people in the population. And this is what is called synesthesia. Oh, synesthesia, let me see if I can spell it. Okay, and you'll notice that synesthesia looks a lot like anesthesia. So anesthesia would be without sense, right? Anesthesia, so if I have an anesthetic, I can't sense something, like I can't sense pain. So syn means coming together. And so this is where people sometimes mix the senses. So this is sometimes referred to as sensory mixing. And so this is the phenomena where people might hear a sound when they see a number, or they might associate a number with a particular color. And what they've discovered with this synesthesia is that generally, or not generally, but in some cases, people who have genius and have big breakthroughs in their fields, like in music or in mathematics, sometimes it is due to the fact that they have the sensory mixing that allows them to see patterns where you would not normally see them, okay? So I have a little video that I accidentally X'd out, so let me find it again.
Imagine a world in which you see numbers and letters as colored, even though they're printed in black, in which music or voices trigger a swirl of moving colored shapes, in which words and names fill your mouth with unusual flavors. Jail tastes like cold, hard bacon, while Derek tastes like earwax. Welcome to synesthesia, the neurological phenomenon that couples 2 or more senses in 4% of the population. A synesthete might not only hear my voice, but also see it, taste it, or feel it as a physical touch. Sharing the same root with anesthesia, meaning no sensation, synesthesia means joined sensation. Having one type, such as colored hearing, gives you a 50% chance of having a second, third, or fourth type. 1 in 90 among us experience graphemes, the written elements of language like letters, numerals, and punctuation marks, as saturated with color. Some even have gender or personality. For Gail, 3 is athletic and sporty. 9 is a vain, elitist girl. By contrast, the sound units of language, or phonemes, trigger synesthetic tastes. For James, college tastes like sausage, as does message in similar words with the age ending. Synesthesia is a trait like having blue eyes rather than a disorder because there's nothing wrong. In fact, all the extra hooks endow synesthetes with superior memories. For example, a girl runs into someone she met long ago. Let's see, she had a green name. Deezer Green, Deborah, Darby, Dorothy, Denise. Yes, her name is Denise. Once established in childhood, pairings remain fixed for life. Synesthetes inherit a biological propensity for hyperconnected brain neurons, but then must be exposed to cultural artifacts such as calendars, food names, and alphabets. The amazing thing is that a single nucleotide change in the sequence of one's DNA alters perception. In this way, synesthesia provides a path to understanding subjective differences, how two people can see the same thing differently. Take Sean, who prefers blue-tasting foods such as milk, oranges, and spinach. The gene heightens normally occurring connections between the taste area in his frontal lobe and the color area further back. But suppose in someone else that the gene acted in non-sensory areas. You then have the ability to link seemingly unrelated things, which is the definition of metaphor, seeing the similar in the dissimilar. Not surprisingly, synesthesia is more common in artists who excel at making metaphors, like novelist Vladimir Nabokov, painter David Hockney, and composers Billy Joel and Lady Gaga. But why do the rest of us non-synesthetes understand metaphors like sharp cheese or sweet person? It so happens that sight, sound, and movement already map to one another so closely that even bad ventriloquists convince us that the dummy is talking. Movies likewise convince us that the sound is coming from the actors' mouths rather than surrounding speakers. So, inwardly, we're all synesthetes, outwardly unaware of the perceptual coupling is happening all the time. Crosstalk in the brain is the rule, not the exception. And that sounds like a sweet deal to me.
Okay, does anybody have any weird synesthetic abilities? Oh, you do like it?
I forget which one it was, but he was saying one of them, and I was like, whoa, yep, I do that.
Oh, interesting.
I think it was the name one.
Where you have names or color related to
They're
green
not
color?
colors, but like I'll see faces and I'll sit there and think about names all day, and I'll just eventually it'll bother me so much that I'll remember.
Right.
Because I mean, a little background on me. This is my 4th college. I've been going to school since 2013, so I've met a lot of people. And I just, like, I work at Safeway right now, and I'll go out on the floor and I'll see people who look like people from places that are not near here. Like, I put faces together really, really well. And I'll see people and I'll think that that's them, and their name will just come straight to my mind. But really, they're in like Missouri or Oklahoma. It's weird. So the name one definitely.
Interesting. Okay, so there's another interesting thing that is related to this somatosensory cortex. I'm going to show a video in a second. And this is what is referred to as phantom limb pain. So you can have phantom limb where even if you have an arm amputated, for example, it still feels like it is there. However, phantom limb pain is actually more annoying, in some cases debilitating, because you could feel like you have, like your hand is placed on a hot surface, for example, or a searing burning, or you could feel like you have a muscle cramp in the phantom limb. And so that can happen because when you cut off a limb, that part of the brain that is associated with that limb is still there. That's so part of the somatosensory cortex. And so the question is how could you convince your brain to release the sensation of pain even though the limb is not there? And so we're going to watch a example. They have a new kind of interesting way to treat this, which is called mirror therapy, which is based upon the science of neurobiology.
Of the 900 amputee patients from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, most injuries can be treated quickly, but there are some haunting side effects. Wagner was injured by an IED while serving in Iraq. He lost part of his right leg, but the pains linger.
Like I could stab anything between my toes with a knife, with a poker, or in the arch of my foot, or the heel, more like annoying ones, like when your big toe's crossed over your second toe, or like when you cut your toenails, there's like a little sharp spot, you put a sock on it, it pulls your toenail back like that.
Phantom pain in general will dissipate over several month period, but in some people it actually lasts for years to decades.
The cause of phantom limb pain is still unknown, but there is new treatment to make this pain go away.
What we've been offering to some of the patients in our clinic here is something called mirror therapy. At the beginning of therapy, they take off their shoe and their sock and then place the mirror between the legs and then move the foot sort of up and down like they're stepping on the gas pedal and lifting off.
It literally feels like you're moving your foot. Like it feels like your foot is there, like the reflection and just the way you move it and everything. I mean, it's nuts.
When the patient uses the mirror and looks into it and sees the reflected image of their intact hand or foot, they think that it is the amputated hand or foot returned. By doing the movements, you're basically either quieting down excess activity in the brain, which may be generating the phantom limb, or you may be wiping away any bad memories of that limb.
Veterans say the treatment is working. Mirror therapy is now offered routinely to lower limb amputees at Walter Reed. Dr. Zhao says it may work better than conventional pain medication for people who want to stay active.
So we're convinced that the mirror is what is actually treating the pain, and it's the visual component of this therapy that's actually modulating pain response. You have young men and women, and they were very active before their injury, and so you want to get them back to the point where they actually can do everything they did before, and hopefully even more.
Wagner says he's almost there.
After I got cut off, I was worried about that. I couldn't do all the things I used to do. But then once I started getting more active, and I've never stopped.
And Wagner says he won't stop anytime soon. From Washington, I'm Walter Morris.
Okay. So I think that's very interesting, the whole idea of phantom limb. And it's kind of almost like our perception of our body is that like our body is just kind of like a puppet, right? And that what we're perceiving in our brain is what actually we sense as our body. Okay. So we also not only have the cerebral cortex in the cerebrum as a whole, but we have what are called the cerebral white matter. So the white matter is, again, tracts or fibers. Sometimes they're referred to as fibers or tracts. So those are myelinated axons, bundles of axons. And there's three categories. The first one are the association tracts. And so they run from one part of the brain cerebrum to another. So they connect different parts of the cerebrum. So for example, we have the primary visual cortex, which is connected to the association cortex. So the primary visual connects to the the visual association cortex. And so this allows us to make sense of what we are seeing. And there is a phenomena that is kind of associated with, not associated, but it is kind of related to this. And that is what is referred to as face blindness. So this is actually the inability to recognize faces of different people. So like, for example, it could be really bad in that you don't even recognize your own face. So if somebody shows you a picture of you, you would be like, I don't know who that is. And it could be bad enough that you don't recognize your children or your spouse just by looking at their face. So they would have to talk to you in order for you to say, oh, I know who you are, right? Or it could just be minor. So it could be like just that I really have a hard time remembering people. And so maybe it has to do with your ability to make a connection between the face and the person. And so that is an example of association. So if we look at these association fibers, notice that they're just running from one area to another. Right? So they're kind of running horizontal in the brain. So they're not going down through the brain and towards the spinal cord. Okay. So the other type of areas that we have would be the commissural fibers. And these connect the two hemispheres. So notice that there is a series of commissural fibers located right here. And so they're running from one hemisphere to the next. And so this is actually a, not a longitudinal, but what would this be? A frontal section of the brain. And so you can see that that is a connection. And what did we call that connection? I mentioned it on Monday. Corpus callosum. So this is called the corpus callosum. So it allows the two hemispheres to communicate with one another. And then we have the projection fibers. So these are myelinated axons that extend down from the cortex, down towards the lower brain centers and into the spinal cord. So this connects the cerebrum to lower brain centers, such as the midbrain or the brain stem, the hindbrain, or the spinal cord, which is actually not part of the brain, but part of the central nervous system. So we talked about one of those just recently. What was that called? Where you go from the motor cortex down to the spinal cord. The example would have been the corticospinal tracts, right? So this is example. So you'll also notice when you look at the this section, you'll notice that there are nuclei. And so these are actually stained pink in this diagram. And if you remember from our terminology, what are the nuclei in the brain? What are they composed of?
Bundles and cell bodies.
Cell bodies, yes. And so they are gray matter. So if we look at this in this diagram, it'd be like this right here. So notice that that is gray matter that is kind of like an island in the white matter. So it's like a little nut in the white matter. So think about that as being a little nut being a little nucleus, okay? And so those are what are referred to as the basal nuclei. Okay, so these are the basal nuclei. So these are aggregations of nerve cell bodies in the white matter of the cerebrum. And so these basal nuclei, interestingly, are kind of associated with fine motor control. So actually like making the movements smooth, right? So this actually they actually help to, what do I say, it's coordination of motor control. And it makes smooths out the movement. I'll just put. So there is a genetic disease that you might have learned about in cell biology that is called Huntington's disease. And it is a dominant disease but it is also a late onset. So it's caused by a defect in a single gene, and that people tend to get it after the age of 40, after they have reproduced. And it is lethal. So it is a terminal disease, and it just causes a breakdown of the motor coordination, right? So people have a hard time walking, they have a hard time moving. Pretty soon they can't do anything, but sit, and then they die. So that tends to be associated with these basal nuclei and the degeneration of the basal nuclei. This is also connected. I'll put that this is connected to the basal ganglia in the midbrain. So the basal nuclei are not in the midbrain. They're actually in the forebrain. They're in the telencephalon. They're in the cerebrum, but they're connected to the basal ganglia in the midbrain. And when we get to the midbrain, this is where we tend to have problems with Parkinson's disease. And so Parkinson's disease is kind of associated to this because the basal nuclei and the ganglia are interconnected, so that there's neurons that run from one to the other and between them. Oops. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to talk about is what is referred to as the diencephalon. So remember, we talked about embryonically how the diencephalon and the telencephalon together make up the forebrain. But because of the cerebrum folding back and over, the diencephalon is kind of buried inside the middle of the cerebral hemispheres. And so the diencephalon includes the thalamus. So the thalamus is the largest part of the diencephalon. I'll just put largest part of the diencephalon. And it is really important because all sensory information that comes into the brain travels through the thalamus. So this is a sensory relay station. So everything that you hear and taste and feel goes through the thalamus. And as such, it is actually really important in weeding out, we'll talk about weeding out some of the information. So we don't want to be overstimulated, which is a problem when some people have autism, they're over sensory stimulated. This also helps to keep us conscious. And our brain essentially alive. So this actually sends action potentials to the cerebral cortex to keep their electrical activity in the cerebral cortex. So if you are brain dead, what this means is that there's no electrical activity in the cerebral cortex. And they can do this by putting electrical things on your head, receptors, right? And they can do what is called an EEG, not an ECG, but an EEG, which is an electroencephalogram. So an EEG is a measure of the electrical activity in the cerebral cortex. So for some reason, if that electrical activity stops, it is very, it's not going to start up again. You can't do a little shot of electricity and start the brain back up again like you can start the heart back up again. So even people, they can swallow, they can hiccup, they can actually even move their eyes because that tends to be midbrain. We can do eye movements with the midbrain, but they're essentially brain dead. And so generally what happens when people are brain dead is that they take them off of life support and then they would die.
Why is it that you can? re-shock the brain like you can the heart?
I don't know.
Because I would feel like if they both do with electricity, I don't understand why.
I don't know. Once you lose your electrical signals in your cerebral cortex, you can't seem to get them back for some reason. Yeah. Okay. So that's the thalamus. And so then we have what is called the hypothalamus. So hypo means underneath. And the hypothalamus, we're going to learn that, is really important when we talk about the endocrine system, because this is connected to the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is our master control gland. So it regulates metabolism, it regulates reproduction, it regulates all growth, for example. So the hypothalamus is the connection between the brain and the endocrine system. So I'll put that connection, oops. Okay. The hypothalamus also regulates thirst. It also regulates appetite. So we have hormones that are produced in different parts of the body, even hormones that are produced in our fat that tell us whether or not we're burning fat. And if we're burning fat, that means we're going to be hungry. We want to keep our fat because it's good storage of energy, right? So the hypothalamus does that. It also is responsible for sexual arousal. So this is the unconscious sexual arousal. So this is just unconscious. So it is almost, we'll talk about this, it's almost like a reflex. So just like thirst and appetite, kind of our reflex, sexual arousal can also be a reflex. Let me look at my notes here. Okay, so this also regulates not just thirst, but it also regulates body temperature. So we have sensory receptors that can detect the temperature, and this could either cause you to shiver or to sweat. So sweating is regulated by the hypothalamus. The next part of the diencephalon, the last part, is what we call the epithalamus. So epi, when you see that word like epithelial tissue, this means upon. Epi means upon. And so this is above the thalamus. And this actually has another name. It is called the pineal gland. And this is responsible for circadian rhythms. So circa dia, that means around the day. So this is responsible for sleep-wake cycles. So there is a chemical that's produced by the pineal gland that is believed to be a hormone. It's kind of, what is it? A candidate hormone. And it actually is really important in other organisms, like insects. It actually helps to regulate when they undergo metamorphosis from a caterpillar into a butterfly, for example. So does anybody know what drug you can buy at the drugstore that will help you go to sleep? Melatonin. Yeah, cough syrup.
NyQuil.
That's not decongestant. That would be the Benadryl, the antihistamine in it. And it doesn't give you really good sleep. It actually kind of makes you more tired. Melatonin actually kind of really does kind of put you into the good sleep because it is naturally occurring. However, there's some people that think that's because it is so significant of a hormone in insects and other organisms that we really don't understand what melatonin does. And so you have to kind of use it with care. One problem is that it's like anything, sometimes you have to keep upping the dose in order to have the same effects. So you have to be kind of careful with that. Okay, so the epithalamus is really weird because it is embedded into the middle of our brain, yet it regulates day-night cycles. So let's see if I can find my image that I wanted here. Okay. So in this diagram, we're looking at a longitudinal section through the brain. So we're actually kind of looking at one side of a hemisphere. And so you can see in purple, you can see the thalamus. So this is the biggest part of the diencephalon. In a little darker purple, this is the hypothalamus, and this is my pituitary gland. Sometimes it's kind of confused here. This is a nerve. This is where the optic nerves cross over, so that's called the optic chiasma. So that's actually part of the peripheral nervous system, not the brain. So here we have the pituitary gland, and then this here is the pineal gland. And notice how it is buried in the brain. But in other organisms that have a pineal gland, because they don't have as big of a cerebral hemisphere, their pineal gland can actually be directly stimulated by light and dark. And so that is the case for reptiles. So they actually have a third eye. And in reptiles, they have what is called a parietal eye. And this is a transparent scale. And this just allows light to stimulate the pineal gland directly. And melatonin is released at night. So that's why, like, if you work at night and you have to sleep during the day, that's why you have to get everything dark, right? So you have to wear like something over your eyes or put black curtains up to prevent the light from coming in, because melatonin is released. I forgot to write that down. Melatonin is released in the dark. So when we look at our eye, because we don't have a transparent scale on the top of our eye or a third eye in the middle of our forehead, we actually have our optic nerve. So the optic nerve stimulates in us, stimulates the pineal gland. So if you have blindness due to a problem with the optic nerve, then you could have a person that's blind who cannot keep a circadian rhythm. Some people are blind, but light still travels in and stimulates the receptors, and there's still action potentials being sent. And so you could be blind, but still have action potentials being sent to the pineal gland, and then you would not have problems with your circadian rhythm. So it's that, I think this gland is really interesting from an evolutionary perspective because of its where it is located and where it was once located in ancestral species. Okay, so this is just a diagram. This is where they have actually taken off the cerebral hemisphere. So this is what is left of your brain. So remember that the cerebral hemispheres make up like 80% of your brain, right? So now we see where the diencephalon is located. So it would be right here, and then this just shows the thalamus, and then it shows the hypothalamus. And we're going to talk about the hypothalamus, and notice that there's mammillary bodies there. And I'm pretty sure that that might have been associated with the fact that it looks like breasts. Maybe a male person named those. But notice how those little mammillary bodies are part of the hypothalamus. What do I want to say about this? Okay, so let's talk about the midbrain. So one of the parts of the midbrain are what are called these cerebral peduncles. So let's talk about the midbrain. Okay, so when I look at this, cerebral ped, so ped means foot, or this could be like a column that something is sitting upon. So this could be like, if you think about the brain or the cerebrum sitting on the midbrain, this is what that is called. So it's called the cerebral peduncle. And notice that it is in green right here. So these would be the cerebral peduncles right here. And these are actually white matter. So this is part of those corticospinal tracts. Right? So this is motor coordination, motor control of the skeletal muscle. It has to come down through the midbrain before it goes into the spinal cord. Okay. The midbrain also has in it a part that is called the substantia nigra. So what do you think nigra means, like in Spanish? What color? Black, okay? So this is a dark staining or a dark object or a dark, it's actually a ganglia. But in this case, it's in the central nervous system, so they incorrectly call it ganglia, but it is actually a nuclei. Right? So it's dark. But just think of it as an aggregation of nerve cell bodies. And this, the reason why they are dark is that they have lots of melatonin. So this is the pigment that gives our skin its color, the pigment that gives our hair its color. And the melatonin is converted into dopamine. And this is also responsible, the substantia nigra is responsible for motor coordination. So in the midbrain, we have problems with Parkinson's disease, or I mentioned long-term use of methamphetamines. So methamphetamine use. And so what happens is that these neurons that release dopamine die. And so dopamine is low in this part of the brain. And so this is what leads to the shaking of people in both of these situations. And then they might start to lose with Parkinson's, you might start to lose the ability to walk because you're shaking so much and you might feel like unstable when you walk, right? And so this is a neurodegenerative disorder which progresses. And they're not sure how. There's different things that they recommend that you do to slow down the progression of this disease. Okay, so let's look at where those substantia nigra are located. Okay. So if we look at a cross section, this is the dark part is the substantia nigra right here. And notice that it is located close to the pyramidal tracts. And then we have the red nucleus. That would be just a different group of aggregations of nerve cell bodies. So action potentials can not only go out through the cerebral peduncles, but they can actually come back up through the midbrain before traveling into the cerebral cortex. So this is a cross section through that midbrain region. Okay, so let's finally get to the hindbrain here. Okay. So one part of the hindbrain, so I put hindbrain as my big. So remember that the hindbrain is also called the rhombencephalon. Is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum has its own hemispheres, and it is kind of organized very similar to the cerebral cortex in terms of different parts of the cerebellum associated with different body parts. So there's a little homunculus in the cerebellum as well, little human body mapped into the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is that part which is underneath the occipital lobe. So if we look at the location of the cerebellum, it would be this part right here. So these are my little homunculus, my little bodies, and how they're associated. And this is associated with motor coordination. And this is unconscious. So one thing that we know that is affected by the cerebellum would be like walking and balance, right? So when I stand upright, I actually have to have muscles contracted in the spine that hold my vertebrae upright. And as I move and shift my body weight from side to side, those muscles have to alternatively contract and relax to allow me to stay upright. And so all of that is done in the cerebellum, and children develop their cerebellum through physical activity, right? So we develop as a child physical activity. That says activity. Right? So, you know, they have the desire to move their body probably more than we do, right, as adults. And that's probably that desire to move the body is because they're trying to develop their cerebellum. So there's actually kind of ingrained, innate behaviors like wanting to get up and walk, wanting to crawl, right? So when you get up and walk, they first have to kind of consciously think about moving their feet, but then pretty soon it becomes in the cerebellum. So the same thing with like jumping on the couch, right? And running across the floor and getting, you know, rolling and tumbling and all of that stuff. That is all about the cerebellum. And so again, we can develop those kinds of motor skills as adults, but it is a lot harder to develop them as adults as it would be if you're children, if you're a child, right? So when have a stroke, for example, and you have to relearn how to walk, for example, it's much more difficult to do that. So physical activity is actually really important in children because of that, even though how annoying. And you want them to just sit still, right? It's like, stop bouncing on the couch, right? Go outside and play. Used to be like, you just say, go outside and play and come back at dark. That's how I was raised. It's like, as long as you were back by dark, everything was fine, right? Okay. Yeah, now we can't. So don't do the limbic system. We'll do that next day. Okay. So we have the cerebellum. That's part of the hindbrain. So the other parts are the pons. And this literally means bridge. And so this is just where the action potentials have to travel up through the spinal cord to the cerebrum and back and forth. So this is connection between the spinal cord and the brain. The last thing is the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata is referred to as the autonomic reflex center.
medulla oblongata.
Okay, so in this autonomic reflex center, we have the breathing reflex. So breathing reflexes. So we'll talk about this when we get to the respiratory system. But if you stop breathing, your pH of your blood is going to decrease, and then that is going to cause you to want to breathe more deeply and more frequently. So that desire to take a deep breath is due to the medulla oblongata. Okay? And then just breathing in and out all the time, that would be the reflex. Okay. And then we also have the reflexes for the heart. So cardiovascular. Which would be like heart rate. So when I walk up a step of stairs, I want my heart rate to increase. But when I'm laying in bed, I want my heart rate to go down. And so that would be the medulla oblongata. So if I go back to my image, of my brain stem. There we go. Okay. So this in light green would be the pons, right? And then this would be the medulla oblongata. It's a slight enlargement. And then that, notice that connects directly to the spinal cord. And then we're also going to talk about these spinal nerves, not spinal nerves. We're going to talk about the cranial nerves. So all those things in yellow are nerves that come off of those different parts of the brain and innervate things like facial muscles, the tongue, the eye. And then there is one cranial nerve that travels down and innervates the heart and the digestive organs, which is called the vagus nerve. So we're going to talk about these when we get to the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for today. Remember that you do have a quiz on Monday, and we have lab. We're going to start talking about the brain on Friday. Hopefully, I ordered some brains. Hopefully, they'll be here. They were on back order, believe it or not. Back order brains.